Welcome to the first of two SY3 screencasts that are going to tackle this topic, the topic of voting behaviour. So, broadly speaking, there are two main questions that sociologists ask about this topic. So, firstly, we've got this question: what are the reasons for variations in turnout in recent elections? In other words, why do people vote or not vote? And then secondly, when people do take part in an election, how do they decide who to vote for? In other words, why do they vote for one party rather than another? And in this screencast, we're going to focus on question number one. Okay, we're going to begin by looking at how patterns of turnout in general elections have changed over time. And just a reminder that this word, turnout, it simply describes the proportion of the electorate who turn out on election day and actually bother to vote. The graph that you can see at the top charts the percentage turnout in general elections since 1945. So we've got the percentage here on the vertical axis, and then we've got every single general election from 1945 all the way up to the 2010 general election. And there were very high turnouts in 1950 and 1951, and then quite a long period with no discernible trend. However, in the 2001 general election, you can see there that turnout slumped to a dramatic all-time low. It was just 59%. And even though there was a modest recovery in 2005, so it went up to 61%, and then a bit more of a recovery in 2010 when it went up to 65%, even in those two elections we can see that the turnout percentage is much lower than the average for the post-war period. And in this table we can see turnout for some of the other types of elections that are held in Britain, so elections for local councils, for the devolved assemblies, the European Parliament, and we can see here that turnout is even lower when we look at these other types of elections. Now, according to David Denver, there are three main ways in which we can explain variations in turnout. Firstly, we can focus our attention on the social locations and circumstances of individual voters, so we can look at their social background. Secondly, we can look at the costs and benefits of voting, so we can look at voting as a rational choice. And thirdly, we can look at how close the connections are between political parties and voters. Now, there are obviously resources that underpin political participation, things like your knowledge of politics, your skills, the time that you have available to you. This first type of explanation suggests that these resources are not evenly distributed across different social groups. And as a result of this uneven distribution, some social groups are significantly more likely to vote than others. So, for example, in the 2010 general election, turnout tended to be higher in more prosperous middle-class constituencies, and also there was a big gap in terms of age. Okay, the second explanation is called the rational choice theory, and this perspective directs attention to the costs and the benefits of voting. And it simply suggests that turnout will be greater when there are more incentives to vote and the costs of voting are kept to a minimum. And going back to our table here, rational choice theory can help us to explain why we see variations in turnout in different types of elections. Most of these elections here are what sociologists call second-order elections, and this means that from the perspective of the voter, not a great deal appears to be at stake, there's much less media coverage, and the parties might not campaign particularly strongly. In general elections, on the other hand, there tends to be saturation media coverage, you can't escape from it, the parties will mount intense national and local campaigns, and therefore the electorate usually thinks it's important who wins, and therefore they see that there's more of an incentive for them to vote in that type of election. Rational choice theory can also help us explain why the turnout went up a bit in 2010 compared to this dramatic low in 2001. Basically, in 2001, the general election was a foregone conclusion. It was obvious to everybody, even before the election campaign got underway, that Labour were going to win. Whereas in 2010, it was quite a close general election and nobody could predict the outcome with confidence. And where an election is close, there's more of an incentive for people to vote. They see it as being more important, and therefore they're much more likely to turn out. And then finally, the last type of explanation that David Denver talks about focuses on the connection between parties and voters. And it's particularly concerned with the impact of voters' identification with parties. So the more strongly somebody identifies with or supports a particular party, the more likely it is that they will vote. And this can be clearly seen by this particular table. So in 2010, those people had a very strong identification with a political party. 82% of them voted, whereas those people who said that they had no identification with a particular party, only 36% of that group bothered to vote. And by the way, this group of very strong identifiers is getting smaller, and this group of people with no party identification is getting bigger. In the 1960s, for example, over 40% of voters had a very strong party identification, and only about 10% of the electorate had no attachment. But according to the British election study, in 2010, the respective figures were 18% for very strong identifiers and 16% for people who had no party identification whatsoever. And this long-term decline in party identification is technically known as partisan de-alignment. So there's a key term that you need to try to remember for the exam. Okay, just a couple of other key concepts to mention before we finish. Those people who still go out to vote to express their support to a party that they do identify strongly with, they're technically called expressive voters. And then this term, normative voter, this describes the types of people who go and vote because they believe it's part of their duty as a citizen to always vote in an election. And what we can see in this table is that older voters are much more likely to be normative voters. So we've got here that 88% of people over the age of 65 agree that voting is a duty, whereas for 18 to 24-year-olds it's 58%. And we can also see here that most older voters would feel guilty if they didn't vote, whereas the majority of younger voters would not feel guilty if they didn't vote. So the concept of normative voting can help to explain the significant variations that we find in turnout according to age. So a very quick reminder of the explanations that we've looked at. So social locations is about looking at people's social background. Rational choice theory is the perspective that says that people are more likely to vote if they think there's an incentive for them to do so, if the benefits seem to outweigh the costs. And then the third type of explanation focused on the degree to which people feel attached to a particular party. So in this screencast on voting behaviour we've addressed this question, and in the second screencast on voting behaviour we're going to look at question number 2.